And I think I can probably handle most of that anyway. So she may have other stuff to do at the moment. But
Sweet. Awesome. Well, guys, thank you everyone, students, hackers, Encode Club community, for joining us for this very special AMA with Juan Benet of Filecoin and Protocol Labs. They, of course, have very kindly been sponsoring our Spark Hackathon, the final of which was delayed on Monday, but will happen this coming Monday. Hopefully to great success. But Juan, we're so delighted to have you to talk about your journey so far, your insights on being a founder, a developer, a product builder, and I know the students are really looking forward to this one. So if I may start with a few simple questions of my own. Young Juan was at Stanford. Did he think he was going to be an entrepreneur when you were studying back then?
Great question. By the way, thank you so much for having me. It's a really great pleasure to be here with you and share this event with you. And super stoked about all of what you folks have been up to with Spark. Have been following the hackathon and just like the posts that have come out of it and so on. So sounds like you had a really awesome event, and one of many. And yeah, looking forward to any future ones that you might do. Yeah, really. So thanks for having me here to chat with you today. And yeah, I think to your question, I guess probably by college, it was pretty clear to me that if you really wanted to, kind of have a very high leveraged level of impact in the world, you have a kind of very narrow set of avenues that you can actually take. And so some of them are by starting things like companies, or it doesn't have to be a company, it could be any other kind of organization. Other ones might be inventing something new or discovering something fundamentally new in science. So pursuing a scientific career that lets you kind of push the envelope. Though that's also extremely competitive, and not just competitive, but there's a lot of kind of very closed off avenues in science itself. And it's difficult today to make the kind of breakthroughs that people in science did in like the 19th century or early 20th century. Science today is much harder to make significant progress in. Funding is super competed on. Most of the funding goes to incremental projects as opposed to radically deep rethinks of things. And I think you can also go in kind of the political route or the kind of organizing activism route and so on, to try and kind of cause change to happen by not any kind of like structured organization like a company or a nonprofit or something like that, but instead of leading movements. And so I think there's of course more avenues available, but it kind of seems pretty clear that for the kind of level of change and improvement that I hope to be able to achieve at some point, that one of these routes would make sense. And the reason kind of a company ended up making sense was that kind of what I started Protocol Labs for is addressing this large, deep problem in funding of science and technology, where science advances pretty quickly, but the technology translation from discovering something to turn it into a product, there's a big gap there between how far the kind of our knowledge graph is growing and how much of that is getting translated into reliable solutions and products and so on that are in people's hands. And that gap is very underfunded. And this is kind of like in the mid 20th century, this is what Bell Labs and Xerox PARC and other organizations like that ended up. That was kind of like a niche that they occupied. And nowadays, that's a large gap. And so I kind of realized that in order to really help with that technology translation, I would have to start something like a company that could be extremely well funded in order to invest deeply in decades timescales level, which is really large budgets. If you go back and look at the budget sheets for Bell Labs, there were like budgets in the orders of many billions of dollars per year, and with timescales of 10 to 20 years of plans. And so you had to have an organization in order to do innovation like Bell Labs, to be able to kind of do fundamental work that push the envelope, not just in kind of fundamental research coming up with new Nobel Prize winning things, but also turning it into devices that people could actually use, like the transistor and you know, undersea cables and all that kind of stuff, like cell phones and whatnot. In order to be able to do that innovation at that level, you would need many decades worth of funding at that scale. And so that really narrows things down to, you can only really achieve success by either running like a major government agency or running a corporation with a large with a really large budget. And so that kind of like constrained the space of possibilities, where I said, okay, well, it's a really hard path, but like it's the only one that's likely to succeed.
And do you think this is, obviously Stanford has a phenomenal record of producing startup founders, probably a little bit in better than I'd say the UK universities. What is Stanford doing? What is it teaching? What is it that makes, I think, Stanford graduates more risk taking?
It's a great question. And I think it's totally right to notice that there's a much higher correlation that is not just the location, right? So one thing that Stanford has going for it is that because Stanford seeded Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley kind of grew around Stanford, then you have this very strong entrepreneurial environment, and all of kind of the magic of Silicon Valley as a society, in terms of kind of how to build new organizations, build new companies, get all of the amazing people that are there that can actually go and work on these organizations to build them, and the funding and so on. So like that whole ecosystem is there, and Stanford helps seed that. So that's one part, but I think now with the internet, that has been more broadly distributed. So I think today you can access a lot of that same culture and a lot of those same opportunities from anywhere in the world, or close to anywhere, maybe not anywhere, but closer. I think more than that, I think the university pays very close attention to paint the possibilities that people have in front of them, and really not, there's a very can-do attitude. A friend of mine once described it as, kind of at Stanford and Silicon Valley, you have this attitude of whenever you come up with a new idea that maybe sounds really difficult or kind of impossible or something like that, and people's first reaction is, wow, that sounds really interesting and really cool. Like, let's do it. Let's figure out how to make it work. Whereas in other environments, usually the response is more like, hey, that sounds like maybe plausible, but why would you want to spend your time on that? Like, that sounds dumb. Let's move on to something else. And so that's kind of a very high level, too narrow description, but it's kind of an expression of the general attitude where I think some universities and some environments tend to promote just the spirit of trying things out and like actually just sticking with them and support people doing that. Whereas other environments are much harder and much, you have to not just do all of the hard things that building an organization like this actually require, but you also have to fight against your own environment that is basically giving you a very negative feedback loops of, no, don't do this, this is dumb, like this is risky, and so on. Another example of this might be, there are certain cultures where taking any kind of risk is very socially unacceptable. So starting companies is very socially unacceptable. And so you end up in a world where there's very little innovation happening. And so you want to orient towards cultures that are very okay with risk. It's not that you don't want a culture that's like reckless, but you want cultures that are okay with taking risks and can navigate that risk landscape to then support people actually taking those risks. So if you're aspiring to do something pretty significant and pretty big, find yourself a really good culture like that. And you don't have to, it doesn't have to be geography anymore. You can get that on the internet. You can find social groups and groups of peers and mentors and so on that can help you in those capacities.
Yeah, definitely. I can say from personal experience, I went to Oxford and there was not a, you should do it, can do it type approach at all. It was very much, you should be getting a job or you are doing something very wrong, quite frankly. So it's really interesting to hear the difference. We have obviously this interesting phenomenon in blockchain, which is that a lot of projects come from universities and research, particularly in the US, from we've had Oasis, you've had Thunder, you've had Algorand, you've had Hashgraph to a greater or lesser extent. Why is that, do you think? Is it just because of the complexity involved? Is it people just cashing in on their significant significant knowledge base and reputation? Or what is going on here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in most parts of computer science, if you're doing something that's pushing the envelope technically, it usually is the case that either universities or corporate research labs have the edge. It's people in those environments that have managed to learn all of the hard knowledge that you require in order to be able to understand how certain systems can work and so on. Blockchains are one example, but if you look back, cloud computing is another one. Distributed systems, like all of the complexity of distributed systems, we now associate with companies like Google and Amazon, but those companies effectively hired all of the really amazing distributed systems researchers from universities and other companies and kind of brought them together into those places. AI and machine learning is another great example of this. You had a ton of people from specific labs that were at the forefront of machine learning, creating these partnerships with specific corporate labs, where these labs were actually able to fund the development, the research development, and then it was kind of staffed by people coming simultaneously from maybe those companies and kind of at the forefront of R&D in those organizations, but primarily professors and PhD students and undergrads coming from those universities. So in anything in computer science that is pushing the envelope, you in technology-wise, not product-wise, engineering and science and engineering-wise, then universities tend to be at the forefront. It's not always a given, right? So a lot of blockchain systems got developed out in the open on the internet because we can do that now, right? Like before, you had to go and like learn for many years in like these university environments where the knowledge was. Now with the internet, you can access that knowledge anywhere. So now we're starting to see a lot of the development happen outside, but it's still the case that the deep complexity of blockchains, especially the consensus protocols part or the all of the zero knowledge proofs world, all of that is really requires, you know, upwards of 3 to 6 years of deep study before you can really move the field forward and really come up with something fundamentally new. And so in that case, it tends to be that university folks are much closer. Now, what's different in blockchains than, say, distributed systems and machine learning is that the amount of funding required to start a blockchain project is much lower. Like you don't need a massive server farm like you would in a machine learning environment. So you don't need to form these partnerships with very large corporations, right? So in the machine learning world, very difficult for professors to go and start an AI company. It happened here and there, but it's more rare than, say, Google or Facebook or other organizations like that starting an AI lab, a machine learning lab, funded massively, and then recruit people from universities. With blockchains, you can actually take specific groups from universities and say, hey, we're going to start a project, we're going to create a project ourselves and fund it ourselves, or fund it with by fundraising or from the community and so on, but without actually needing to go to a large corporation.
Awesome, that makes complete sense. Well, moving on from kind of one almost one university-like experience to one kind of almost university-like experience, YC. I mean, obviously this is a big part of your journey. Someone consider this a YC education, probably the best education an entrepreneur can ever had. What was that process like from applying with Protocol Labs to, yeah, how good was it? What sort of people did you meet along the way?
Yeah,
tell us about the insides of it.
You know, highly recommend YC. So I think probably I'll mention maybe 3 things. First and foremost, the knowledge that YC has accumulated and is actively making available online is extremely valuable. And so this started with Paul Graham's essays, and it grew into kind of like the startup class that Sam Altman gave, and Sam Altman and a number of other folks worked on. And now it's kind of the YC podcast and the blog posts and so on. That amazing compendium of knowledge is the best material that we have on how to build companies, how to create startups, how to run organizations and so on. There's a number of other resources. I'll call out maybe Blitzscaling from Greylock and of course there's Harvard Business School and so on who've been publishing case studies for a very long time. There's a lot of other really, really great resources out there, but I think YC has managed to build the best one by far. And hey, it's the internet, all of it's available for free anywhere, so you can hop between them. And so I'm incredibly thankful to YC for gathering that and making it available. That's probably one of the best, one of the best kind of like, I think predictors of success is how much of that knowledge entrepreneurs have ingested and actually internalized. That's one part. The second part is the program itself is phenomenal. You get a number of other peers who are kind of in the same boat, kind of in the same stages, and you put them together. And that kind of cohort and class environment creates an extremely great culture where everybody's kind of pushing each other to achieve more and be better and so on. And so I think that's a phenomenal part of the program. And so if you're considering starting a startup, highly recommend applying to YC. I think it will super worth it. The third thing I think is probably the most important in the long term is the advice that you get. So the specific advice you get from people who have been who have built companies like this, who have run organizations, who have encountered all the problems that you're like, or most of the problems you're likely to encounter, and who can listen to you and put themselves in your shoes and give you advice on the spot of what's likely to work is extremely valuable. That on its own, if you could get nothing else out of YC but just that, that's still worth it. Because when you're building an organization, you'll encounter a whole range of problems, and this applies for companies, but for really anything, any kind of project, you'll encounter massive problems that will kind of try you to your limits. And in those moments, what advice you get and who you listen to really matters, because a lot of people have a lot of things to say, and oftentimes they're wrong, or oftentimes they haven't. Maybe they're kind of right, but not fully right, or maybe they did something once and it worked out, but you really want the advice of somebody who has seen it 10, 20, 30 times, who has kind of integrated what actually works and how to navigate those circumstances. And being able to access that level of advice is incredibly valuable. So, for those three things, I would say, YC was super valuable, highly recommended. Now, I think on all those 3 points, again, the internet is helping distribute it. So the knowledge is out there. You can form cohorts and groups of people, and you can get access to that knowledge by cultivating a really great mentor base. And I think YC knows that, and that's partly why they're now creating cohorts that are distributed, right? And so that's really exciting. So now you no longer have to go to Mountain View and so on, or SF to participate in YC. Now you can participate anywhere, and that's really powerful.
Absolutely. I put the links to the Paul Graham articles in particular because they are practically the Bible for building a startup. So last question from me before I hand over to the students. So how did Filecoin come about? How did Protocol Labs come about? And what was the reception of the YC guys at that stage? Because this is 2014, it's early, and I'm sure they're forward thinking, but to take a crypto startup at that point is still a big step. So yeah, tell me about this whole aspect.
Yeah. So I mean, the long-term goals of PL are, going back to kind of this, like creating an R&D lab where you can fund technology translation from science into products and so on. That I aligned with Sam Altman like long before I went into YC. I had a number of conversations with him about this and really resonated with his views and my views. Kind of, we shared a lot of kind of insights in terms of, hey, what's actually broken in the innovation pipeline and how might you try and fix it, and what kind of organizations you could build. So that was kind of a very helpful kind of common ground that made me comfortable with going to YC, because the kind of organization that I wanted to build is not a typical kind of like modern day Silicon Valley startup. It's deeper and longer term. I think when I kind of happened upon what kind of eventually turned into IPFS and Filecoin, though that combination of protocols made just a ton of sense to build with a company, and with a company that could be kind of funded by YC or other groups. And at the time, yeah, it wasn't really clear what the right funding model was for crypto startups. I think the YC folks should get a lot of credit. They saw a number of really valuable projects in the space. For example, Coinbase was another one, where even though they themselves maybe didn't understand or know the space that deeply, they were able to figure out who was going to build potentially really, really compelling organizations, and they took these bets, right? And I remember like in my YC interview, someone was basically like, hey, what you're talking about is super crazy. It will either work massively or totally fail. And like, that's great. And like, that's exactly like the kind of organization that YC kind of is good at identifying, finding, and funding. And like, that's really their great business model. And so I think they get a ton of credit for like finding really great crypto startups, even at that time. I think since then, the world has changed a lot, and there's now a whole bunch of different structures. Some things don't even make sense to fit into the kind of YC model. There are a lot of crypto organizations that grow from communities online, where people just kind of publish a paper or publish a bunch of ideas, and then kind of people form a project loosely and then kind of create a thing. So it doesn't really look like a startup at all. And so I wonder how YC might adapt to support those kind of projects, or if those are just come totally out of the picture. We'll see. I don't know how that'll develop.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to ask some questions from the students. So let's. I will read them out.
Sorry, maybe I'll mention. Sorry, to interrupt. I'll mention one more thing.
Go for it.
We're starting a project with Consensus and the Tachyon Accelerator to build an accelerator program very focused on Web3 and very focused on IPFS and Filecoin. It's called the Filecoin Launchpad. And so if you're building tech using IPFS or using Filecoin or Ethereum or things in that environment, definitely recommend checking it out. It's going to be a pretty different program, and I would, again, would highly recommend going to YC anyway, and would highly recommend checking out Tachyon if you're in that environment. The program that we're kind of building, applications I think close in like a couple of days. So if you're building a thing, now's your chance to get some funding and some mentorship. We're taking what we've learned around how to build programs like this and really tune it for projects building in a fully distributed crypto-oriented landscape and environment. And so yeah, definitely check it out. If that might be pretty interesting and relevant to a bunch of folks.
Absolutely, guys. I've put some links in the chat, including the link to the accelerator. Especially if you've done one on the hackathon, I think that already gives you a head start in the application process. So to the many of you who did Filecoin in the Spark hack, definitely you should apply. It's a fantastic opportunity. Right, let's go into some student questions. So the first one is from Nikolaus, who's a PhD at ETH Zurich. And he says, what was the most difficult part in building Filecoin? Were you expecting it to be done sooner?
Great question. Yes, we were expecting it to be done sooner. I'll mention maybe 3 things that ended up being harder than we expected. So one of them is just the specific proof of replication constructions. I don't know how familiar people are with Filecoin, so I probably won't go and explain it, but you can find all of this online. There's a specific cryptographic protocol there called the proof of replication, and there's a whole bunch of different constructions that you can use to achieve proof of replication. And I think one part that was way harder and full of kind of unexpected turns that we expected was constructing a proof of replication that worked not just in theory, but also practically with the given hardware constraints and the software constraints and so on. And so achieving a really good POREP that fit our constraints turned into a much larger problem than we expected. So that's one. The second is the complexity of Filecoin itself. And I think the complexity of blockchain, layer 1 blockchains in general, kind of appears here. You can look at most other projects that are trying to build layer 1 chains, and they take quite a while, especially the next generation of chains. They kind of push the envelope on scalability or shards or proof of stake and so on. And so I think like the complexity of the consensus protocols, the complexity of certain scalability requirements, the complexity of then piecing these things together with others, that turned what maybe individually might have been much easier problems into this combinatoric explosion of problems where one problem, you end up in a world where the whole shape of the protocol has so many constraints, so many different dimensions you have to deal with, and you're doing this innovation with many people, like 30+ people, where you end up in a world where anybody can spot parts of the protocol that you can fix and improve and so on. And when you start improving and fixing something in one end, you might accidentally break another end. So it's a highly complex way to develop things right now. And in my mind, I think it's very similar to how chip manufacturing worked in kind of the 90s and maybe 80s, 90s. I don't remember exactly the timeline, but there was this transition point where people went from manually laying out chips to then having to use computers to drive a lot of this work. And the computer tooling actually was instrumental in achieving the next layers and so on. And I think we've reached that with blockchains. The level of complexity of the protocol design is so vast that teams of people will really need computer-assisted R&D tools. And so that means much better simulations, much better ways to decompose problems, much more robust foundations in terms of approaches to doing certain things or not others. And so we're in a world where these protocols, which often include very new cryptography, are so it's kind of like a whole edifice of cutting edge cryptography all over the place. And if you misuse something anywhere, you can break the whole thing. And so you really want to have software help you figure out how to build all of this. And so I think like one of the things that contributed just an enormous amount of time to that was kind of unexpected was that it's just like the sheer complexity of a protocol of that size and in this environment. And I think it hit everybody else. It hit every major project, ended up delayed by much longer than people expected. I think it's going to get better, but not yet. Meaning, I don't think many people are building these tools that I'm describing yet. If people go out and build these tools, then maybe building protocols of this scale and magnitude will get a lot faster. But until we do that, I think we'll still have kind of these gaps. And maybe the third thing is just general software. Whenever you're building a software project, and where you actually not just have hard technology to solve, but hard product constraints, you end up in a world of where there's like this really hard optimization and hard estimation problems. And so a lot of like the normal software tropes apply to us as well. So those things kind of combined and made us end up with a much larger, much more complex thing than we expected.
Sweet. Let's go to Dennis's question. He says, many open source projects that were developed as community endeavors end up in private hands. How do you know that Filecoin will not end up in private hands?
Can I get a little bit of clarification by what we mean by private hands?
I think just owned by private corporations, I think is what he means in this case.
I think kind of like, I mean, I think Bitcoin and Ethereum are good examples of escaping that. And I think a lot of other blockchain projects are similar, where they've managed to move in a very different direction. And even though there's a lot of folks who've tried to build permission blockchains or kind of like company-driven things, there are really good qualities about kind of the requirements of what a blockchain needs to be, like a public permissionless blockchain needs to be, that make it very, very difficult for, say, one corporation or one group to keep control over it. And so from my perspective, there's a deeper question and larger question, which is, are blockchains going to be, are public permissionless blockchains going to be the best way to provide the kind of transactions and the kind of smart contracts that people expect of them, right? So you have to think of the blockchain as a tool and as a system choice that satisfies certain requirements of the applications. And if some other group finds a better way to do that, that is not a permissionless open blockchain and so on, then there's kind of some danger there. I think this really boils down to hard questions around scalability. So I think like most of the applications that people are excited about for blockchains really need very high scalability. You need transaction throughputs that are rival or are better than kind of centralized cloud environments. And at that point, like you're really in kind of like the billions of transactions per second. And in some cases with like very short transaction commitment, meaning being able to do transactions in kind of sub-second areas. And in order to achieve that, the blockchain systems designs will have to change a lot. Like the sharding systems and so on will have to adapt to that. And if we don't do that, then I would predict that the blockchain space in general might get replaced by centralized architectures. But we have this gap of time where we actually have the advantage right now to be able to build those systems. But we basically have to achieve that level of quality of service and that level of transaction throughput within 3 to 5 years. If we don't do that in 3 to 5 years, I think we'll end up in a world where all of the utility of blockchains and smart contracts are going to get kind of siphoned into single corporation products.
Sweet.
It's kind of what happened to social media, right? So like if you try to build a social media network that to rival something like Facebook or Twitter and so on, the UX complexity was so high that very few community projects ever came close to being able to rival those organizations. I think nowadays we could, but the sort of kind of like battle was lost to kind of closed networks and kind of walled gardens. There's a very large open question for VR and AR. So there's a huge open question as to whether or not VR will become the walled garden worlds of the current social media landscape, or they will be much more like the web or blockchains, which are much more open, permissionless environments that are community driven and community owned. And that I would say like that's really kind of a toss up. And I think right now probably the advantage is on the single corporations, unless we drastically improve the quality of the tooling outside. You can think of like Oculus and a few other groups who are just developing a ton of tooling and technology. And if a lot of that doesn't end up in open source software, then we're going to be way behind.
Awesome. Next question from Zenon from University of Cape Town. Do you angel invest in university startups? I think he might have a startup, but do you angel invest in university startups?
I invest very rarely. I do sometimes. I would actually, more than me directly, is I just recommend the accelerator program that I talked about a little bit earlier. Just apply to the Filecoin Launchpad, and that might be like a pretty interesting opportunity for you. And yeah, I don't know if that helps answer it, but.
Awesome. Next, what's your favorite blockchain project or startup that is not Filecoin or Protocol, obviously?
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to pick. There's a lot of like really, really amazing stuff going on. I have to say like the community and R&D going on around Ethereum and Ethereum 2 is phenomenal. And if folks haven't gone to a DevCon, highly recommend doing it. The Ethereum community has just managed to build a really, really amazing environment filled with folks trying to push the envelope on all kinds of technology problems. And that's been really, really awesome to see. I think also I would strongly highlight Polkadot. I think Polkadot is also making really, really awesome improvements and really interesting designs and systems. There's a lot of like very interesting development going on there. Tezos and the kind of automatic upgrading of the network is super promising and super interesting. I think that kind of stuff is, yes, it's super valuable. There's a few projects that I think are still kind of in stealth mode that are working on zero knowledge oriented chains, and those are really promising. I'm super excited about those, and I think those are gonna be pretty significant and pretty big in the next year or two. And so I think that those are kind of like maybe some of the projects. I mean, there's all kinds of layer 2 stuff that is kind of independent of layer 1 that has that are lots of really interesting applications. Like the entire DeFi landscape is awesome to look at, and there's a lot of like really, really great stuff being built out there. I would say projects interacting that think about how to new primitives for organizing communities and organizing and governing communities are super interesting to me. So one of them, and I'm a little bit involved with this project. SourceGrid is phenomenal. If people haven't seen it, it's this amazing vision of trying to change the relationship of value flows, where value is really about relationships and not about transactions, and trying to build tooling for giving communities abilities to understand the value flows within one community and kind of understand where the contributions are coming from and so on, can yield really awesome new funding structures and new just new reward structures and incentive alignment and so on between projects in a much larger, grander scale. So I think there's a whole family of projects around that I think is super promising and super valuable. And I think if we can use kind of like what blockchains are really good at, which is financial structures and new primitives for governance, and kind of like new, like a little legal infrastructure in a box, right? Like if you can use smart contracts, financial instruments, and all of the Web3 kind of privacy-oriented tooling to build new ways of organizing groups of people. Kind of like, if corporations were invented a long time ago, but and they were a super useful and super valuable idea, there might be whole other new ranges of things, right? DAOs are one example. There's a lot of other things coming out in that direction. So I think like that frontier is amazingly interesting and amazingly valuable. It's very early though, so I wouldn't go into it and expect like something massive in the next year or two. I would go into it advancing the state of the art and understanding that movement and that change is going to take 5-10 years to develop, but something really fundamentally valuable in a humanity level scale valuable could come out of that.
Awesome. Next question is from Philip from the University of Zagreb. How would you raise money as a founder today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I would probably find ways of aligning with people that really agree with the values of the project you're trying to build, and really understand kind of like really long-term aligned. I think there's a lot of the funding landscape is very short-term oriented, and so you end up with misalignments that occur when people want to be more short-term or long-term oriented. I think that means there are specific angel investors, there's specific VCs, there's community. So that's kind of like the traditional funding environment where you can find those people, and it'll really narrow. Like already fundraising is really hard, and when you try to narrow this down to like who's really aligned long-term, that's like you end up with a very small pool. That's where programs like YC become super valuable and super useful because they really help you find those networks and so on. So it's kind of like traditional way, and that's still going to work really well. So for a lot of folks in a lot of businesses, that'll be the best way to do it. But I think now we're in a different environment where you can go and fundraise directly from the community in different kinds of structures. And so anything from for specific blockchain projects, you can think of token sales. For other systems, you could do different kinds of fundraising schemes where maybe you fund specific milestones for projects, or there's a ton of grant funding going on right now. So we live in a world right now in 2020 where capital is actually quite cheap relative to maybe say 20 years ago. And you can find a lot of money floating around. And so if you're, and there's a deficit of knowledge and work in like this really complex knowledge work in this environment. So I think right now, if you're trying to start a project, chances are somebody out there somewhere is giving grants or fairly like really good term level funding for kicking off your project. And you can do things now that maybe a lot of startups couldn't do 5-10 years ago. And so I would probably, if I was kind of looking for funding, I would first start looking at what organizations could give me a grant to work on exactly what I'm trying to work on. And I don't have to like kind of create an investment relationship. Because by the way, whenever you take people's money for investment, you're making a very hard promise to like return it in like a, in a much, you're promising to return a much larger amount of money later. And that's just a different kind of relationship than a grant. A grant is, hey, we're interested in the work you're doing. Hey, please do this work. Here's some funding so you can do the work. And then that kind of relationship ends at the moment that the work delivers. And so kind of try and find those structures. And then I would say you could go the DAO route and you could kind of lay out the plans for the thing and then try a very different alternative way of organizing a group, which is not the traditional startup environment, much more organic, much more amorphous, way more chaotic, like dramatically way more chaotic. And you'll encounter all kinds of problems that nobody's like, or few people have encountered and few people have written about. So you'll be forging a new ground. But who knows, maybe that can be really promisingly and successful. And there's a lot of things that then plug into that where you can think of like quadratic voting and things like that as ways of getting the community to fund those projects. So yeah, there's a lot, probably never been a time as good as this as in order to get funding for your projects.
Yeah. Absolutely. A question from Eduardo de Silva. What's the one thing that Paul Graham said to you that you still remember?
Actually, by the time I went to YC, Paul was kind of much more in the background. He was already retiring. So I actually didn't interact with Paul that much. I met him a couple of times, and we were just talking about other tech. I mostly I don't remember anything super salient in those. I think the most salient things are just the learnings from his essays. I think which I still go and reread a few times. So there's just a tremendous amount of knowledge there, and it's available for everybody. So go and read those. It's a lot of really valuable insights there.
Awesome. Let's go to Michael, who was built Codigo in the hackathon. What indicates that your personal project / idea is capable of becoming a startup rather than just a fun side project?
So let's start by defining a startup. A startup is kind of like a high-tech startup is an organization focused on growth, where you are building an organization in a particular way where you aim to achieve a certain level of scale in a very short time scale. So think of like the growth of social networks, where they went from 0 users to millions of users to billions of users in the span of like 5 to 10 years, right? In some cases, less than that. That kind of growth, which affects not just the product, but affects the organization and the company and so on. You have to like be in a mode of constantly leveling up the team. Every quarter comes with totally new challenges. You have to staff the organization with people who are super growth oriented and who are going to be able to wear many hats, and who are going to face entirely new challenges a quarter or 2 quarters from now that are going to be either totally new to them or are going to be at kind of other limits. And so it totally changes the nature of how you build an organization to say, hey, I'm trying to build a startup. A startup is not kind of like a low growth company. So there's a lot of companies that get started and you can get capital for them and so on, where you're aiming for a slower growth, or you're aiming for a market that's of a smaller size and so on. So really distinguishing that and saying, if I'm going to build a startup, it's about growth and about kind of like reaching this very large scales in a very short time. Once you're in that environment, then kind of like certain specific products and projects will have really large potential of really being something great that can be used by tons of people. And it could be consumer oriented, or it could be B2B oriented, or it could be kind of community oriented projects. And it also has the potential of there being a pretty significant market. So startup companies, you need a specific business flow, and you need a specific market that's associated with that, and that market has to be potentially pretty big, right? So if you think of search or advertising or like Airbnb's business model, or those kind of marketplaces, or API companies like Stripe and so on, like payments, Rails and so on. There are a lot of different kind of business models and so on that will come associated with a market that's really massive. And so a startup where you try to achieve that level of growth in that short time scale also needs to couple with a pretty large market. Now you don't tackle a very large market from the get-go. You kind of target a smaller market in a smaller area, and then from there grow. But if the market in the long term isn't actually very big, then it's not really a startup. It's a different kind of company, and you should grow it. You should start it and grow it in a different way. And so really knowing what you want to orient towards is valuable. I think right now there's a lot of projects. It's kind of a different landscape. There's a lot of extremely valuable projects that are going to make fundamental improvements to the world and to humanity that do not at all need to be companies. And I think that's the kind of stuff that is tragically underfunded. I think the blockchain environment has a lot more funding for those kinds of projects through grants and so on than many other industries. So that's great, but I still think it's like tragically underfunded. And so tons of things end up getting wrapped up into the trappings of a company in order to fund them. So as a good example, like I actually think like Google itself started this way, where like the early Google team didn't really want advertising. They didn't look at the world and say, what the world needs? More advertising. No, like that's not like the intention at all. They wanted to build a search engine, and they wanted to build, but they had already built a search engine. They wanted to scale it, and they wanted to grow with the internet, and then they wanted to build a whole bunch of other applications to go along with that. Things like maps, things like mail, and so think of like all the Google suite of products, right? All of that, trying to cause it to exist in the world requires deep amounts of capital, and especially in that time frame, the only real way where you were going to be able to do it is if you had a company and a really massive business. And so therefore they landed in the advertising route. And so they said, okay, well, we want to do all these great things. We need a lot of money to do that. Therefore, you end up kind of creating this business that's oriented towards advertising. And I think right now it's less so the case. Like you could build something like early Google and not have to fund it as a company. I think it's better now, but it's not perfect yet, and there's still a big gap. I think probably the most important thing that could happen to enable more amazing projects to exist without companies is some structure like UBI. So maybe not UBI, maybe something else, but something that really liberates the builders in the world from having to kind of like be in like, traditional wage slavery, right? Like if you can move it into a world where you can really devote your time in like the 10-year time scale and not have to worry about providing for your family, and you can then focus on working on what you think is the most valuable contribution to humanity. If we can move into a world like that, then I think like that would be the biggest unlocking moment for just a large scale amount of improvements that we would see around the world. Because you look around and tons of people are working on are spending all of their hours, most of their hours working on a bunch of things because they have to, not because they think that's the most valuable contribution to the world. And so kind of shifting that is probably one of the most important, valuable things to do. And so this is why I'm super interested in different kind of financial systems that could yield things like that. Things like source grid, things like UBI, and so on. I don't think any of these things are ready yet, in that a lot of it's not really clear yet what's actually going to work at large scale, right? So for example, UBI there's a lot of experiments that need to run in order to actually reliably show that this is actually going to work great at large scale, right? Like kind of like the scale of the whole world. But something like that we have to find some structure like that works economically, where like the economic incentives actually work out. And if we can do that, then it'll be probably one of the most important transition moments for our species, where we'll be able to then unlock the potential of building really valuable things without having to attach it to a short-term capital-oriented, short-term returns thing. And that, I think, is like, if you're looking for projects and you want to do something really great, go work on that. Go work on rewiring how money works.
Sweet, fantastic answer. Let's go on to the next. We've kind of done those two. So if you were 21, would you get a job at a top crypto firm, or would you start your own thing?
I probably wouldn't go into funding early on. I mean, so I do think like working at a crypto fund might give you exposure to a lot of projects, and you'll be able to talk to a lot of people building things. And so you could probably use it as a way to learn a lot of things. And no question, investing is a super valuable business model. So if you're looking to make a bunch of money, then hey, that's like a pretty risky but like a straightforward way of doing it. And so maybe if you can couple that with deep learning, and you spend a lot of time with the companies that you're potentially investing in and so on, then maybe that can work out. But I honestly don't think like that's the highest value use of your time. I think the highest value use of your time might be in building specific projects, like finding something that you think needs to exist, something that will, where you can say, okay, well, if it's not me, then who else is going to build this? And where you can actually devote 5-10 years of your time to building that thing and kind of pushing the envelope. I think that's probably going to be more valuable for you and everybody around you than going into investing. I think like there's a lot of people investing. If you want to go into those kinds of models, then yeah, I would go back to think of new and alternative ways of funding things and come up with new funding structures. That I think might be more interesting and more valuable. So I would go towards that. Look, life is short, so you like once you go into something, you're going to spend many years there, and it's going to take your life in specific ways. And when you're kind of at the end of when you're at the next transition point between that and whatever your next thing is, you'll be in a different place. And so you have to like plan carefully what the potential outcomes are. And sure, all kinds of serendipitous things happen, and maybe you go and join a crypto fund, and then you find an amazing project, you join that, and then you do like really, really amazing work. But I would say like just I see a lot of people with like all of their years passing by very quickly, and they always kind of want to have some really large impact, and they're not focused on projects like that. And so I would more kind of go and join if you're thinking of joining a thing instead of starting a thing, which you know, I think there's like too much of a premium on starting things. I think like oftentimes more would get done if more people just got together and worked on things serially together. I would probably find an organization trying to work on breakthrough tech and then join that or start something like that.
Awesome. Next question. How does Filecoin deal with potentially sensitive files and illegal kind of stuff being stored on the Filecoin network?
This is a great question, and it is like all great questions, doesn't have an easy answer. Maybe the summary answer is it depends on the miners who are storing the data, and they ultimately choose whether to store it or not, and it depends on their jurisdiction. So, for example, let's call them bad bits, like bad bits that people don't want hosted, tend to be controversial. So because people don't want to host them for some reason, and in some cases there's like bad bits that most people in the world agree are really bad and you shouldn't distribute. And then there's a lot of bad bits that one group thinks are bad and another group does not think are bad. And that's the tricky bit, the part where people greatly disagree on whether something should be distributed or not. Now, in those cases, you end up with a lot of salient examples that are, think of like all of the whistleblower materials that came out in the last few years. A lot of that stuff might have was totally illegal to distribute, but really important socially to do so. Certain countries like change government by starting with kind of disseminating speech and work that other people want to censor. There's all kinds of repressive governments that block things, right? Like and block books and all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty hard. The right way to navigate this is that you have to let people select whether or not they want to distribute something. You have to put the power and control in their hands, not in the controls of the platform, not in the control of necessarily other authorities or the society, but on the individuals themselves. And so people need to decide, yes, I'm willing to host this, or no, I don't want to host this. And one of the facilities that ends up being important is when a client is hiring a miner to store data, clients and miners being able to agree on like a well-known list of bad stuff. And the miners can say, hey, I don't know what you're asking me to store because it's encrypted, I can't see it. But if this hash of this content appears in this list, I'm going to drop it. And being able to agree on that upfront is super valuable to allow people to, in various jurisdictions, comply with their local regulations and not store content that they don't want to store. By the end of the day, it's a market, and some other people might be willing to store it. It really depends on the kind of individual, subjective and intersubjective judgment of people. And so having a model that allows that is the right solution, we think.
Awesome. Next question: are Filecoin hiring from universities, both students and researchers? Yes,
totally. So Protocol Labs is hiring a whole bunch of folks for a ton of roles. You should check out our positions site. I'll post a link. And we are hiring all kinds of folks for many different kinds of roles. Ton of research-oriented roles, probably more so than a lot of other organizations, and mostly kind of in cryptography, distributed systems, and so on. But pretty much like any computer science or even other non-computer science related fields that have given you deep insight into science and technology and research and so on can work. So definitely come check out our jobs listing.
Awesome. Let's speed through these last questions. I'm quite conscious of time. What do you feel the role is of luck in success?
Luck is super important. I think that you can be. So a couple thoughts. Like one is luck definitely favors the bold, right? Like there's all these quotes that say like you can definitely do a lot of work to put yourself in a position where it's more likely that good fortune will manifest, or rather when opportunities appear, you're going to be in a much better position to seize them. And so I think like you have to do a lot of good, like hard work, good thinking, and so on to put yourself in positions where good luck will help you. And so no question, all kinds of things are, you know, in this kind of like probabilistic environment where certain things serendipitously occur that are really put you in one place or another and make certain things happen and not, and so on. But I'm a firm believer that, and have a lot of, you know, data that backs this up, that you can definitely put yourself in environments and in situations where you're just vastly more able to take advantage of those opportunities. And just, you know, and then you can seek out emitters of opportunity. So think about modeling this as like a large graph where opportunities are kind of appearing randomly in the graph, and maybe certain areas of the graph have more opportunities than others. This is kind of like what made Silicon Valley very interesting in a large period of time in the world. There were just a lot more opportunities for certain kinds of development. And now with the internet, a lot of that is getting more broadly diffused. But now social networks become important, like not social networks, the products, but rather specific relationships and the ability to talk to specific people and so on. Those kinds of things become kind of sources of opportunity. So you can think of the whole system and plot out what you think might be good emitters of opportunity and luck, in a sense, and then maneuver yourself and your organization to a point where you can be close to those emitters and be tapped into them, so that when those opportunities strike, you have a very large probability of being able to take advantage of it, or at least hear about it, right? So a good classic example might be, hey, there's a lot of grant funding going out in the world. Do you know about it? Probably not. You don't see it. You don't constantly look at everybody's blogs. But a lot of those organizations have newsletters. Subscribe to those newsletters. Get a ping whenever they announce a new grant. Now you have opened yourself up for opportunities. You have enabled luck to find you. And so it's a lot of it is in your hands, and a lot of it is in the environment. And it's this trade-off in between them where you have to kind of align yourself so that you'll be able to take opportunities. And then the second thing I would say is, look, no matter what 2020 humanity is complex and so on, but we live in a dramatically better world than, say, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. So the opportunities available to you today are unparalleled in human history, and so we live in a world where, with hard work, with knowledge, I think knowledge ends up being sometimes more important than hard work. Knowing where to look for certain things. With knowledge and hard work, you can really achieve anything. And it just becomes kind of like hard work, knowledge, and time and capability. And you can kind of zoom out and think about the entire system holistically and say, what are the things that are going to enable me to seek out opportunities? What are the kinds of things that are going to enable me and my group of people to take advantage of those opportunities and do something that's really valuable, and then kind of feed that back on itself to then achieve more and more and more and more. So simultaneously think, you know, it's stochastic and luck oriented, but you have a massive amount of control as to whether or not you expose yourself to all the right places and all the right opportunities. So, you know, I think hackathons are a good example of the kind of thing where if you choose to go to a hackathon, you're choosing to get connected to a lot of other people that are builders and creators and so on. You're forming relationships, you're hearing about opportunities, and so on.
Awesome. Well, I'm conscious of time, so let's go for one last question. What's the best advice you'd give to people looking to be founders?
I would say probably really try to learn as much as you can about what starting organizations is like and how to make it successful. And as part of that include, do you actually want to do that? Starting an organization and making it succeed is incredibly difficult. And it'll be the hardest thing you've ever done. And many times you'll be in so deep and you're like, this sucks in a ton of ways, right? So a good book for this is Hard Thing About Hard Things. Like, go read that book and look at the things that Ben Horowitz writes about, and say, do I actually want to create a company? Do I actually want to build an organization? And it really has to be the sort of thing where like you you have no other option, meaning like, it's way easier and way better if you can go and like join an organization that already exists, already doing the thing, than starting one. If you're going to start one, just be ready for an incredibly challenging environment, very low probabilities of success, super difficult, super trying in all kinds of ways, and very delayed reward, right? Like, you know, many years before you achieve the level of success that you need in order to actually justify like all of the work that you did and so on. But it can be super worth it, and especially what you build, if the organization you build greatly exceeds what was possible before, right? If the group or thing or business that you build wouldn't have otherwise been built, then like that, you know, then it's totally worth it. But I think like learning as much as you possibly can about what it's like to build these organizations, go read a bunch of the books written by founders and CEOs and other company operators that have built things. Go like watch the YC classes, go read the essays, go watch Blitzscaling. There's a bunch of like really good interviews. Go watch the YC podcast. Like after you've ingested all of that and you've seen and you've been able to kind of like hear from a lot of people that built these things, what it's like, then you can decide, yes, this is definitely something I definitely want to do. And if so, you're going to be much better prepared for it. You are now going to be able to operate at a drastically better place. And so I think like simultaneously both in terms of giving you the practical, high quality knowledge that you will need in order to succeed, and forming some, you know, initially one-way relationships because you're just reading other people's material, learning as much as you can about it is going to set you up. It's going to put you in a really great position. And then separately, it will also really give you a good sense of the journey, and you'll be able to decide for yourself whether or not you want to do that.
Awesome. Well, Juan, I speak on behalf of the many students who've joined and say that was absolutely fantastic. I think we had more questions than we've ever had for an AMA, which speaks to your credit. So thank you very much for your in-depth answers as well. I know that even the students who missed today are going to really look forward to watching this back and reading the transcript. So thank you hugely.
Thank you for having me. This has been really awesome to get to talk about this. Really enjoy it. And I and a number of folks at PL are available to help you think through all of these kinds of things. We're super open group, and if we can help you at all to be successful, yeah, we would be happy to try. So yeah, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for your questions. Good luck with all your endeavors, and like go on make something great.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone that joined, all 100 and something of you. We will we'll let you know about all the Filecoin and Protocol Labs initiatives that are coming up in the next few weeks and months, so you can join and build your startups on Filecoin. All right, everyone, thank you very much. Have a great evening or day wherever you are, and thank you once again.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.